With that, we will go live. Excellent. All right. Hello, humans. Welcome to the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix Sunday Speaker event. Remember, if you like our content, press the like button and subscribe to get more of our content. Join our Patreon, or better yet, become a member of HSGP. Today's presentation aligns with our values of responsibility in that each day, each of us make choices. These choices, large and small, all have consequences for ourselves and the world around us. Global awareness. The end goal of global awareness is global citizenship, which recognizes our personal responsibility to foster a healthy and dignified life for everyone in our global community, and peace and social justice. True peace involves an intense commitment to social justice and affirms the human rights and personal autonomy of all people. Today, we have David Swanson with Humanism and Anti-Militarism. David Swanson is an author, activist, and journalist and radio host. He is the executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. Swanson's books include A War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org. He hosts Talk Nation Radio. He is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and he was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. Please give a big HSGP welcome for David Swanson.
Hi, thanks for having me. A wonderful organization and group of people you've got here. Let me know if you can't hear me or you can't see what I'm talking about. I'm going to share a PowerPoint and go through a lengthy pre-written presentation to try to get quite a number of ideas across, and then I hope that we have some time for discussion and questions. I saw that peace was in the graphic of values there in the background when Mars was speaking. So in theory, I shouldn't have to say a word here, and I shouldn't say anything that anyone will disagree with, but we will see. So let me share screen and see if this works. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Orange and black slide. Okay, so whether humanism means atheism or a commitment to questioning all accepted beliefs, or an identification with all of humanity rather than a small subgroup, or a celebration and promotion of all the richness of human culture, I'm in favor of it. And it has a great deal to do with the project I work on called Anti-Militarism. I work for an organization called World Beyond War, where, speaking of world citizenship, you can get yourself a world passport, a name that is basically a positive way of stating the negative position of anti-militarism while implying something more than that, much as the name humanism is a positive way of stating the position of atheism while implying more than that. I sometimes gently nudge anti-militarists toward humanism, even while working with many terrific religious peace activists, including some of our very best peace activists who are explicitly motivated by religion, and working for organizations that take no position on theism. I say gently because for some people, urging them away from religion is highly offensive. It's certainly also true that for some people, urging them away from militarism or imperialism or patriotism is highly offensive. Nonetheless, I'm going to be fairly straightforward and not especially gentle in what follows, as I try to suggest that every humanist on earth ought to be committed to ending all war. I hope it will help make clear from the outset my awareness of the fact that, just like every other person who has ever lived, I have myself believed ridiculous things, done regrettable things, tolerated horrendous things, and failed to think various things through to all their implications. I'll probably even demonstrate much of that in what follows, even to myself if I read this 10 years from now. Our understanding of things is and should be constantly changing, usually, I hope, improving. The comical idea that one can pin down eternal truths in a single book or speech that will never get outdated is not, I think, a humanist idea. A column in the New York Times on December 18th, 2020 began with these words, quote, "This year has awakened us to the fact that we die," end quote. I find two things remarkable about this. One is the notion that up through 2019, nobody had yet heard about dying. The other is that this column, despite beginning in this way, went on to repeatedly inform us that there is simply no way to know whether anyone dies. Now, perhaps the author didn't really mean that nobody prior to 2020 knew they were going to die, but rather that few people had lived with the anxious thought that death might very well arrive at any moment. But did the author imagine that homeless people never think? What about people who live under the constant buzzing of armed drones that could obliterate them with a missile at any moment? Or people on the run as refugees from wars or violent governments or gangs? Or people in hospitals on life support systems? Or people with no prospects of finding food? Or people with a century or more of living behind them? Of course, most people who have long lived with the possibility of swift death are among the other 96%. That marginalized percentage of humanity outside of the United States. By definition, they aren't part of the first person plural in the New York Times. But what does the idea of a general unawareness of death prior to 2020 say about elite awareness of people lacking health insurance, people lacking proper diets, people working extreme hours for low pay at dangerous jobs, people living in environmental disaster areas, or people living through the extended traumas of so-called natural disasters inadequately responded to? The same newspaper on its website homepage on December 21st claimed that $600 was going to save millions of people from a winter of poverty. The column in the New York Times goes on to assure us that there is just no way to know whether death is followed by more life, or in other words, isn't death at all. Perhaps this is simply required nonsense mandated by the overriding need to avoid angry emails to the editor. But isn't it rather odd, in a media outlet and a media culture that trumpets the need for verified and documented facts, that the absolute importance of shunning and even censoring any unproven speculation, and the absolute importance of that, generally denounced as so-called conspiracy theories, whether or not any conspiracy is involved? Isn't it odd to nonetheless declare that people may very well go on living after death? Are there multiple authoritative named sources for that claim? Of course not. How about unnamed government officials assessing that claim with medium high confidence from the so-called intelligence, so-called community? Nope, not even that. Instead, the Times cites an academic field as the basis for its claim. Of course, no newspaper would write that biology tells us unicorns aren't real, yet they very well might be. Nobody can tell. It's a matter for literature. Yet the Times writes that science finds death to be death, yet we just can't be sure. It's a matter for religion. Denying death doesn't get you labeled a death denier in the way that you might be labeled a climate denier or a pandemic denier, and not for any reason related to knowledge of the matter, but rather as a cultural preference. Now, I want to suggest that militarism gets the same cultural preference that the afterlife gets. Cartoonist Matt Worker drew a cartoon that shows a couple visiting a therapist. The man has a military uniform and a head made of weaponry. The woman is the Statue of Liberty, and she's saying to the therapist, I know, he's rough on my economic competitiveness, abusive of my environment, and this national security thing is a joke, but I can't imagine life without him. The cartoon has the title Military Codependency Complex. The mission of World Beyond War is to envision a world without the male half of that couple. Why is it so difficult? Well, just as millions of people are raised to believe in a virgin birth, millions of people are raised to believe in nuclear deterrence. Just as millions of people are raised to believe their dead loved ones are looking down on them, millions of people are raised to believe that violent activities that traumatize almost every participant are natural and inevitable. Just as people are told that loaves and fishes can multiply, so are they told that putting over $1 trillion into future wars is done with a different sort of money than the money we just don't have enough of to help people who lack work or health care. Just as we're told that a beautiful child got cancer because God's wonderful plan is beyond our understanding, We're told that invading countries and kicking in doors and murdering families makes us safer. Not because that makes sense or has been proven, quite the reverse, but because secret, lawless government departments know better than we do. Or because, as Jerry Falwell declared, God is pro-war. And we're not just told these things, we're shown them in countless stories, children's stories, TV shows, movies, history books, video games, pre-game ceremonies, and holiday celebrations. We're saturated with the normalization of war. Armistice Day is now Veterans Day. And in various cities, Veterans for Peace groups are barred from participation. Towns have been pulling down racist war monuments because they're racist, without anyone having identified what a non-racist war monument would be, and without anyone even noticing that they are war monuments, until a legal ban on removing war monuments gets in the way, as in Virginia, which has no such ban on removing peace monuments and would have a hard time finding very many to remove anyway. In 2019, a third of people polled in the United States supported an aggressive nuclear attack on North Korea that would kill 1 million people, about the same as supported it if it killed fewer people. Some polled were less supportive of war if it killed more people, but others more supportive. Over the years, various talk show hosts have surveyed US residents on sidewalks, no doubt editing out anyone intelligent and not claiming any scientific results, but producing clips in which people solemnly explain that a certain fictional country, invented by the questioner, has to be bombed. Everything else has been tried already, they explain, despite literally nothing having been tried and despite the country and any conflict with it not even existing. Serious polling finds similar results. If you ask people if they support starting a particular war and ask a second group if they support the same thing while knowing that all peaceful possibilities have been tried already, as if exhausting such possibilities were actually possible, and ask a third group if they support the war while knowing that peaceful alternatives exist, the predictable result is that the third group shows less support for the war. But the second group, the one informed that everything else has been tried, shows no heightened support. In fact, it shows the exact same support for the war as the first group, the one asked the simple question with no added information. This is because the first group simply assumes that all possible alternatives have been tried. It's a matter of faith. One need not actually know what's been tried or be capable of explaining how exactly it is that nothing else can be tried. One simply believes, as a matter of faith, that in stark contrast to every actual war that has ever actually happened, the US government has, in this latest case, done everything possible to avoid starting a war. So, just as evolution and evil and benevolent atheists and the questions of who created God or where Cain's wife came from are not the very most popular topics in church, the fact that Libya was not about to massacre people, or Afghanistan was willing to have bin Laden put on trial, or Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, or the Gulf of Tonkin incident didn't happen, or Mexico did not trespass or shoot first, or Spain wanted the matter of the USS Maine sent to neutral arbitration, are not the most popular topics on network or cable news. Actual wars are the result of tremendous efforts at avoiding peace. In contrast, mythical war is forced upon reluctant heroes who sacrifice themselves to save the world. Which one makes you feel better about your tax dollars? Which one is more comforting? This is why Pearl Harbor is holy ground in the religion that holds kneeling during a national war anthem to be sacrilege. Unfortunately, it is as mythical as Eden. The United States spent years maneuvering for war with Japan and avoiding all steps toward peace. The US government made lists of steps that would provoke Japan and took them and expected an attack that was not on US soil, killed fewer people than are killed every day now by the US government's handling of coronavirus, and damaged only 2 ships beyond repair. World War II is the genesis myth of US militarism, and no more real than Genesis. It is the topic of my book, Leaving World War II Behind. with the obligatory, if silly, preface that nothing excuses Germans or Italians or Japanese or anyone else for the evil things they do. It's necessary to point out to people in the United States that World War II had nothing to do with saving people from genocide, in fact, quite the reverse, that the US and other governments refused to take the Jews out of Germany, that World War II could not have happened without World War I and the manner of ending it, that the bunk science of eugenics and a Nordic race was developed chiefly in the United States, that the Nazis came over to the United States to study its segregation laws, that the genocide of the Native Americans was a primary inspiration for Hitler, who explicitly sought to emulate it, that US corporations armed and supplied the Nazis right through the war, that the US and Western governments passed up numerous opportunities to oppose the rise of Nazism because they preferred it to communism, that the United States welcomed 1,600 Nazis into the US military, that former Nazis were responsible for the US government's underground fortresses, for key Cold War lies about the Soviet Union, and for the weaponry that destroyed Vietnam, that the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki prolonged the war rather than shortening it, and that nonviolent activism in its infancy showed enormous potential against Nazis and has shown incredible success in the 75 years since. Generations full of wars that very few pundits even try to defend. Wars that now happen in a world without colonialism and conquest in any way resembling the 1940s. A world in which fears of each new, quote, Hitler in our war propaganda are ridiculous, but deep and powerful. What do the scientists say is an overused question. I don't want to know whether scientists believe we could nuke Mars and then build suburbs on it. But it's interesting that the one place that question does not get asked is religion. Murder is evil and illegal is an even more common statement than ask the scientists. Yet an exception is carved out for it as well. If something is war, it's not murder. This is not simply a question of scale or of bigotry, though both play into it. If you kill large numbers of distant foreigners, it's obviously not murder. But law professor Rosa Brooks testified to Congress several years back that blowing up people, almost always unidentified people plus anyone near them, with missiles from drones might be murder and might not, depending on whether it was part of war. And because then President Obama kept hidden a secret memo on his justifications for blowing people up with missiles, there was just no way to know whether that was part of war, and therefore no way to know whether it was murder. Now, somebody can tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe even the Pope any longer has the sort of power it takes to transform a distant killing into a possible non-murder by announcing that he has a secret memo in a Vatican drawer. An atheist has a minor challenge, not nearly as difficult a challenge as choosing between food or medicine, or whether to immigrate, or whether to be a whistleblower, but a mental challenge worth noting. An atheist has to know and love and respect people, huge crowds of people and individuals who all believe something or claim to believe something that the atheist thinks is as loony as a monkey on LSD. But everyone, if we think about it rightly, has that same challenge, whether or not they are an atheist, and not just because there are lots of different religions, most of which have got to be sheer bonkers, even if one of them is right, but because people's worldviews differ dramatically on numerous topics. If you believe that the best evidence thus far suggests that wearing a mask helps slow the spread of a deadly disease and is not particularly difficult to do, you have the challenge of being neighborly to many of your neighbors who seem not to have heard about masks, for example. There's a guy named Denver Riggleman who has been my misrepresentative in the US House for the past 2 years. He wrote a book about Bigfoot, which seems to have made him some sort of authority on all things crazy. In recent months, he's denounced various right-wing theories about pandemics and elections and advocated for a sort of sane conservatism. I'm 100% in favor. Good for him. But think for a minute about what he himself believes in, contrary to all available evidence. Trickle-down economics, denial of the severity of the environmental crisis, and of course the benefits of extreme hyper-militarism. Only those things are not crazy, and not because of anything related to what we know about them, but rather because of how many times our televisions have told us they are not crazy. If you question right-wing economics or climate denial, you may get some very angry responses, but you won't typically be told that you're violating a taboo. There are very few topics that will get you accused of rudeness for talking politely about them. One is, of course, religion, but there are others that come close that will certainly end your appearances on major television programs. MSNBC got rid of its top host, Phil Donahue, for opposing war on Iraq, and kept Chris Hayes on only because he abjectly apologized for saying that calling war participants heroes was a technique used to justify wars. Polling has found that the top answer in many nations around the world to the question of what is the greatest threat to peace is the United States. Share that information with your extended family during a holiday Zoom meal and swear to me that nobody will be angry or upset or in denial. The number of international comparisons of freedoms and liberties, no matter how defined, that have ranked the United States at the top is a big fat zero. Yet no other nation on earth spends even half, and very few even 10%, and most of those largely on US weapons, what the United States does on its wars for freedom. How welcome would that news be in your local newspaper? Republican Senator Ron Paul was booed in a presidential debate some years back for quoting Jesus, suggesting that the golden rule should be used in international relations. Try refusing to pledge allegiance to a flag in a school, or to participate by standing and putting your hand on your heart for flag and war hymn ceremonies before a big event, and see what happens. Why is questioning religion or militarism offensive? That's not normal. When you question religion, you're told not that you're mistakenly questioning proven facts, but that you are insulting someone's identity. When you question militarism, there's a variation on that theme. Typically, you're told not that any of the post-World War II wars have been glorious or that Lockheed Martin really does need your money, but that you are insulting the people who take part in the wars. However, when you point out that the top reason military recruits give for signing up is a lack of alternatives, and when you ask whether war supporters love the troops enough to make college a free part of public education, the way normal countries do, you're told that you'd have no freedom to express such insanity if not for all the death and destruction visited on the earth by the heroic troops, and that you should therefore shut up and not exercise the rights that they have killed people for. My chief complaint with religion is not the songs or the architecture or the books, much of which I love. It's not the organization. I've always marveled at people opposing organized religion as if disorganized religion was better. It's not the stupidity or irrationality. Everybody's got those things. My chief complaint is with training people to believe that authorities must be blindly obeyed, that their mysterious ways are beyond our ken, that we must submit to catastrophic courses of action because they know best. I mean, it's nice not to be responsible for anything. It's nice to imagine that the world isn't being destroyed, that ecosystems aren't crumbling, that humanity has no power to destroy humanity, and that nothing on earth really matters because eternal paradise awaits. I've always marveled at the notion that humanism makes nothing matter, when it's reducing the world to merely, quote, this world, in contrast to infinite existence somewhere else that seems to make nothing matter. I mean, it always seems to be the same politicians who bring a snowball into Congress to disprove global warming, who also claim it doesn't really much matter because it's just, quote, this world. Well, not always. Let's not forget the scientists who want us all to move to Mars. But those who tend to question accepted wisdom also tend to be the people who think everything matters quite a bit. Authority is a long-established propaganda technique, one of many widely used in war propaganda. I don't mean respect for someone who's earned it. I mean blind obedience to someone set up as an authority. I mean what happens when the civilian public starts calling a president its commander-in-chief. And an authority doesn't even have to be a person. It can be a colored piece of cloth. If you do a web search for images of Bellamy's salute, you find countless black and white photographs of US children and adults with their right arms raised stiffly out in front of them in what will strike most people as a Nazi salute. From the early 1890s through 1942, the United States used the Bellamy salute to accompany the words written by Francis Bellamy and known as the Pledge of Allegiance. In 1942, the US Congress instructed Americans to instead place their hands over their hearts when swearing allegiance to a flag so as not to be mistaken for Nazis. The problem is not the arm position, but the pledging of allegiance. Once you've pledged your allegiance to a flag, what are you to do when someone waves that flag and screams that evil foreigners need to be killed? Rare is the US government whistleblower or war veteran peace activist who won't tell you how much time they spent trying to deprogram themselves of all the patriotism that was put into them as children. Some people who visit the United States from other countries are shocked to see children standing, using the modified salute of hand on heart and robotically reciting a loyalty oath to a nation under God. It seems that the modification of hand position has not completely succeeded in preventing them looking like Nazis. Of course, millions of people will object to militarism, but not patriotism. What they need, they'll tell you, is the right kind of patriotism. There's nothing wrong with loving a country, they'll tell us. Loving one country doesn't require hating other countries. That's the bad kind of patriotism. Or that's nationalism, not patriotism, or vice versa. The real dangers, according to some, are provincialism and globalism, not patriotism. States' rights and international courts threaten our sacred sovereignty, but there's nothing wrong with nations if handled properly. There's no reason for that beautiful poem we opened with today to be about all of humanity. It's better if it's about 4% of humanity. Yet it is only at the smaller level that democracy seems to work. And it's only at the larger level that we seem to have a chance of addressing global crises. And it's the national level that has the militaries and wages the wars. Why aren't local and global flags holy objects? Maybe I'm biased because I live in a part of the world where localities and states get very little pomp and circumstance, and where the national government is a war machine masquerading as a normal country. Well over half of the money that the US Congress decides what to do with every year, the discretionary budget, goes to war and war preparations. Dealing weapons to war zones, parts of the world that manufacture almost no weapons themselves, is a huge business dominated by the United States. Over 90% of foreign military bases are US foreign military bases. When I watch the UVA basketball team beat yet another unfortunate opponent, I have to thank the troops for watching from 175 countries. Why? Do they ever thank the rest of us for watching? Would it hurt anything if they watched from 174 countries? Or 3 countries? Really, who would panic? But when I take my concerns to my local government, they listen and act. Even my state government is responsive to my desires. And globally, I see efforts at disarmament and the rule of law and environmental protection stymied by a handful of rogue nations that includes my own. Why shouldn't I criticize patriotism? Religion and faith are part of what I cover in my book, War is a Lie. Faith is a very dangerous habit, including faith-based news consumption. When there's reporting on a local crime or scandal, most of us like to be sure that the facts are well documented. But when Iran has supposedly been building a nuke, or Russia has supposedly been blackmailing a US president with a video of somebody peeing on him, a US president who mysteriously rips up treaties with Russia, sabotages Russian energy deals, arms Russia's neighbors, builds bases on Russia's borders, bombs Russian troops in Syria, sanctions and expels Russian officials, etc., well, then faith is enough. If we don't put faith in the goodness of the CIA, we, for some strange reason, must therefore be pledging our whole souls to Russia. This is weird. We ought to be able to simply ask, may I please see the evidence that Russia did that thing, and then I'll condemn it right after I see the evidence. Religion is a great tool for bigotry, and so is religious thinking. It's much easier to bomb people who have the wrong religion. It's also much easier to believe that super smart precision bombs murdered only just the very most proper people and nobody else if we adopt a religious-like faith in the pronouncements of the Pentagon. Religion is also a great tool for the pretense of morality in mass slaughter. I wrote a book about just war theory called War is Never Just, a position, by the way, now taken by the Pope as of October this past year. I found all the criteria of just war theory to be either amoral or unmeasurable or impossible. I also found the whole thing to be an odd vestige of a Roman imperial worldview that we mostly don't share. The saints who invented just war theory to justify war did not, by the way, claim that war was self-defense. They opposed self-defense. They believed that killing you was doing you an enormous favor. It was sending you to a better place. If someone was willing to kill you, you should know enough to get out of their way. Yet today's Western war culture, which focuses heavily on claims of defense, also uses the language of just war theorists to plaster a gloss of pseudo-morality over the pools of blood. I concluded that for a war to meet all the criteria of just war theory would be impossible, unknowable, and meaningless, but that it was far worse than that. If a war did miraculously meet all the criteria and do more good than harm, it would still never do enough good to outweigh having kept the institution of war, the standing armies, the bases, the ships, the planes around waiting for the just war to arrive. This is so because military preparedness generates wars, most of which nobody tries to defend as just, and also because the institution of war kills more than the wars. Through its environmental destruction, its promotion of bigotry, its erosion of the rule of law, its justification for secrecy in governance, and especially through its diversion of resources from human needs. 3% of just US military spending could end starvation on Earth. Militarism is first and foremost a literally unfathomable spending of money, a fraction of which could transform any number of urgently needed projects on a global scale. Not to mention that it creates the risk of nuclear apocalypse, which sorry for what that beautiful poem just asserted, would in fact permanently defeat democracy, along with humanity and most other life. In October of 41, Franklin Roosevelt made a speech in which he falsely claimed that US ships attacked by Germany had not been participating in the war, falsely claimed to have a map outlining Nazi plans to take over South America, and falsely claimed to have in his possession a Nazi plan to eliminate religion from the world. Those first claims have been debunked and detailed. We have a good idea which British staff person drafted the phony map of South America and how it made its way into FDR's speech. Reporters even asked to see the map right away, but were denied. As far as I know, nobody asked for the plan to eradicate religion, not right away or ever since. Needless to say, FDR's claim was not based in reality. Religion was openly practiced in Nazi-controlled nations, in some cases newly restored after Soviet-imposed atheism, and medals that the Nazis bestowed on their biggest supporters, including US supporters, were shaped like crosses, which FDR claimed would be banned. Why did nobody investigate the fictional Nazi plan to eliminate religion? It's possible that people simply understood it not to be a literal claim at all, but rather a mythical defense of holy religion against evil, not something to be questioned with skepticism or seriousness. But all war propaganda should be so questioned. If humanism means identification with humanity, I think it guarantees peace. Look at this graphic. Crazy ideas like universal health care and public college and aiding people put out of work by a pandemic are not things to speculate and theorize about, but things we are already doing, if we is humanity. I wrote a book called Curing Exceptionalism, in which I maintained that US exceptionalism, the idea that the United States of America is superior to other nations, is no more fact-based and no less harmful than racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. The first section of the book is a glorified list of statistics with minimal discussion. Its purpose is to examine as fairly and honestly as possible, with the most reliable data available, how the United States compares with other nations. Is what is often called the greatest nation on earth actually greatest in any measurable category? Is it in fact the least great in some ways? Is it in many ways just kind of average? I'll save you the suspense. The United States ranks number one in no significant desirable area and is generally at or near the bottom among wealthy nations. Having established some knowledge of how the United States actually compares with other countries, I move on in part 2 of the book to examine how exceptionalists think, relying heavily on their own words. Exceptionalist thinking turns out to have rather little to do with facts and a great deal to do with an arrogant attitude. In the third section of the book, I argue that this attitude is not harmless, that in fact it brings a great deal of suffering to both those who engage in it and those impacted by it. Given this understanding, I'm compelled to attempt the book's fourth and final part to suggest what I see as the most promising steps for curing exceptionalism, for developing better ways of thinking, and for taking the actions those new thoughts lead to. These steps include reducing dependence on patriotism as a sense of identity, learning about and appreciating the world, imagining role reversals, and taking some care with language, including the use of the first person plural. There is a great deal to be gained and enemies to be lost by identifying with humanity. If humanism means a celebration of human culture, I'm for that too. All human cultures, they all have good and bad in them. I'm for celebrating the sacrifices of the nonviolent activists who have improved our world and whose resistance to coups and occupations and tyranny are more successful than violence. I'm for recognizing the heroism of healthcare and essential service workers during pandemics. Albert Camus' The Plague has nothing on today's reality. I think we should start thanking everyone for their service who performs an actual service. We should even celebrate religious peace activism and religious peace teachings, even when the very same religions have just as many adherents claiming with equal fervor that their religion justifies war. There are great sources of inspiration in religious peacemaking. Reverend Raphael Warnock, candidate for the U.S. Senate in Georgia, now U.S. Senator from Georgia, preached in a sermon you can watch on YouTube that nobody can serve God and the military. If God were to show up and inform everyone that that is in fact his, her, its view of the matter, I think it would make up for a great deal that he, she, or it otherwise has to answer for. Erasmus had the same opinion, even supporting a ban on anyone who had participated in any war receiving a Christian burial. That position sounds crazy in the United States of 2021, not because of its religion, but because of its opposition to war. We are in great need of peace culture. This is why World Beyond War promotes peace holidays and peace music and peace literature and peace journalism and envisions a world beyond war in a book called A Global Security System, an Alternative to War. I, of course, imagine even more than that, even as much as John Lennon imagined, even more. Even a world beyond war, beyond religion, beyond authority, beyond racism, beyond environmental exploitation, beyond tribalism, beyond capitalism, and beyond the lazy acceptance that there are systemic evils constructed by humans that humans can't choose to leave behind them. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was amazing. Can you talk more about that global security system piece and what some of those measures are? When you talked about imagining, what is that look like?
It is a book put together by a group of wonderful colleagues, not one person, and drawing on wisdom from numerous fields. And you can read the whole thing for free on the World Beyond War website or get it as an audiobook or paperback book or whatever. And it lays out models of what global government might look like, how the United Nations might be reformed and democratized and expanded to better serve its purported goals, what economics might look like, what the rule of law might look like, what culture might look like in a world that had moved beyond war. But people always used to say to me, well, if you don't have war, what would you have instead? And I would be just flabbergasted and stymied. Well, not war. Like, what would you have instead of torturing kittens? You would just stop torturing kittens. But you want me to give you an alternative? You're going to torture frogs. I mean, what do you mean you need an alternative? But we have a structure, an economy, a system of government that is set up for war, that treats war as the first alternative, that puts more money into preparing and planning for wars than anything else. And you can't continue with those systems and not get wars. So we do have to have an alternative view of how to structure governments and economies and cultures if we're not going to keep getting wars.
Thank you. If you have questions, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask it. Otherwise, put it into chat. David Faust has his hand raised and would like to ask a question. David, go ahead and unmute yourself.
There we go. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. With the new Biden administration, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because I see a lot of relief among people on the left that, oh, Biden's president, everything's great now, we're saved. But I do see so far not a lot of hopeful signs from his administration as far as some of the people he's appointing to positions like Samantha Power, that was key in creating the duty to protect and justifying wars in Libya and Syria. And I see a lot of aggression still towards Latin America and China in the Biden administration. So I'm wondering, how can we, what are people doing on the left to try and raise more awareness of anti-war activism and keeping it from dying out in this new administration?
Thank you. Excellent question. Some people, of course, sadly, potentially disastrously, are doing nothing. They're off to have brunch. Finally, everything's fixed. And I think this led to catastrophe in the politically and for the world in the early days of the Bill Clinton administration and in the early days and years and beyond of the Obama administration. I think when you elect people to power who you think it might be possible to move toward better positions, and when you're facing catastrophes of climate and environment and risk of nuclear apocalypse and inequality and risk of fascism, that the people coming into power are clearly not taking appropriately enormous steps, left to their own devices. And you have to do your job. Things have been put backwards in terms of the duties of a citizen in the United States or a resident in the United States in many people's minds, so that they imagine that where they have to be more active is prior to an election rather than after it, which is ridiculous. It's after it. So if you go to nohoneymoon.org, which was created by another organization I work for called rootsaction.org, you'll find the activities of people who think a honeymoon is inappropriate and think that the Biden administration, like everyone else, needs to be praised when it does good and encouraged to go farther, and needs to be heavily pressured where it does bad and encouraged to take a different approach. So, you have potential openings. You have the possibility, although, we're getting on to a week without it happening now, of Congress again ending the war on Yemen and not having it vetoed and actually ending the war on Yemen in every way. You have the possibility of better relations with Iran, with Cuba. You have a commitment now to to renew the START treaty with Russia for 5 years. But what about restoring all the treaties illegally torn up by Trump and by George W. Bush before him, and all of the major treaties that the United States has never joined? It's party to fewer human rights treaties than almost any other nation on earth. And you have disastrous nominees as well as some good ones, which is a very mixed bag, and you don't know what the outcome in policy is going to be of having people who dramatically disagree with each other. The least awful CIA director in recent memory, and perhaps the worst boss in director of national intelligence that we've ever seen, right? Who's going to win out? You have the advocates for a coup in Venezuela attending the inauguration with Biden. You have Victoria Nuland, chief architect of the coup in Ukraine, an advocate for a coup in Russia, being nominated for Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. You have, the Secretary of State, Blinken, is a horrible nominee. So you have a very mixed bag of better people and worse people. And I think most significantly, you have this desire to start passing massive spending programs, mostly on good things, and with some excellent measures in there that don't cost a dime, like restoring some value to the minimum wage, but with most of the money to be taken by simply going further into debt, which of course the United States always does principally under Republican presidents, and nobody cares unless it's a Democrat. But it's not the smartest move, and it misses the chief opportunity here, which is to move money from militarism to human and environmental needs, as well as the campaign promised commitment to go after inequality and really tax the billionaires and the corporations and the multimillionaires, which there's just the very most token effort from Biden since the election. So, the idea that your role is to sign on as a fan of one of these two teams that have taken over the U.S. government and shut up and obey, that this is what leads to disaster. And I guarantee you it will backfire on its own terms. The Democrats will be the minority by far in both houses of the U.S. Congress 2 years from today if they don't do more for the good of the United States and the world than they have talked about in much longer than my lifetime.
Thank you. Next up, we have Shira. Shira, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, David. I'm Israeli with left-wing ideology, and there was an interesting article on NPR this morning about Israel and the United Emirates' recent peace deal. The term that they were using was peace for peace instead of peace for land. And I would argue that it's peace for capitalism in this instant, but I was wondering, given some of the ideologies that you've mentioned before, do you think peace for peace is possible, or even fair to ask of people who live in countries that are under occupation?
I don't really think that a peace agreement between two countries who aren't at war and which entails future weapons deals is a peace agreement. I think it's a war agreement. It's better than a war. It's nice of them to call it a peace agreement. I appreciate that, Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Cesar Chavez now have their portraits in the Oval Office, and the Pentagon has long had a peace pole. But I think, that the substance matters more than the portrait. And I think an apartheid state making a deal with a brutal dictatorship, armed, trained, and funded by the U.S. military, incidentally, to make closer ties with each other, to deal weapons more with each other when they weren't at war. I don't think that's a peace deal. I think that part of the United States obligation to immediately end the war on Yemen has to include immediately ceasing to provide weaponry to the United Arab Emirates as well as Saudi Arabia, and to make that policy. And I think Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's bill, the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, is a step in the right direction. Stop being the principal weapons dealer to abusive dictatorships and governments around the world. And then maybe take another little step beyond that and question how the heck you can provide deadly weaponry to anybody and not have it abuse human rights. Isn't it a human right not to be bombed? And just stop being, the weapons supplier to the world. This is not that the State Department should not be a marketing firm for US corporations. And disgusting as it would be in terms of morality to claim that that's an economic or jobs program, that's false. It's not true. You know, the United States would have more jobs and better jobs putting money into infrastructure, education, green energy, even not taxing it from working people in the first place. So military spending reduces jobs, eliminates jobs. It's very difficult for your average television viewer to grasp because everybody's neighbor works for a subcontractor of the military. Those are real people with real jobs, but we would have more jobs, better economy without dumping a dime into the military. And so would Israel, and so would the United Arab Emirates. And so, yeah, I'm wildly in favor of peace agreements. I just don't think everything that's called a peace agreement is a peace agreement.
Thank you. Again, if you have questions, raise your hand or type it in chat. I'll go ahead and ask this. So you said that the greatest threat to peace is the United States. And when you question militarism, you're insulting people's identity and the troops. How can we change that? What does that look like to move forward from where we are?
Well, I think part of it is outgrowing the nationalism in positive and negative senses and developing an identity with humanity. When World Beyond War does webinars with hundreds of people from all over the world, and we talk with each other and we use the first person plural, and then we say, we are going to do this and our interests are that, we start thinking of ourselves as humanity. And then when we think, how can we go after war? Well, we go after the big weapons dealers, even if one of them is the government under which some of us live and some of us don't. We go after the big wagers of war and the big builders of bases around the world, even if, you know, one of them is the government under which some of us live and some of us don't. And we go after them together. We try to close a base in a country with activism by those in that country and those in the country that owns the base, working together globally. But we don't oppose only U.S. wars or only U.S. weapon sales. We oppose everybody else's wars and weapon sales too, and we advance universally and equally global measures to disarm and move toward non-violent systems of a rule of law rather than a rule of force.
Thank you. Thank you. Chet, you are up next. Go ahead.
Okay. I appreciate your talk. I love that first slide you had up that said, imagine everyone living for the moment. I think that's probably a quote from John Lennon. Is that right? Yeah.
That is right.
Well, my problem is I don't live for the moment because I've got to have property to survive, or I wouldn't have any place to live tomorrow. And so that makes me a subject of the institutions that give me the right to own property. And I think the reason none of us wants war, none of us wants a horror of it. But yet, when our institutions that give us the right to own property are threatened, we want the biggest weapons imaginable to protect our right to own property. And not only do we have the right to own property, but the government gives us godlike status over what we own. So in effect, the government becomes our God. And this is why I believe that all humans go to war in universal belief that God is on their side. Because we see our very existence threatened when our institutions come under attack. And I just wanted to say that if we couldn't figure out how to live in the moment, I think that'd solve a lot of problems. I don't think it would end conflict entirely, but conflict would be governed by our instincts instead of our godlike status that governments give us. That's not a question. It's just a comment, I guess.
Well, if I could make a comment and a question in response, my comment with regard to John Lennon would be, of course, my understanding of his lyric, Living for Today, was meant to be in contrast for living for some future eternal paradise. It wasn't to say we must think only about this particular day of the week and not make any plans for next month and be completely irresponsible about what might happen next year. That's never been what I understood from that lyric. My question would be, could you please tell me who it is that's threatening your right to own property?
Well, that right, without institutions, no one's got the right to own anything. I mean, the indigenous people were shocked to the core of their being when they realized that these white men from overseas were allowing people to own property. I mean, the obvious question is, what's going to happen when a few people own everything? And I don't think that civilization has ever asked that question. I mean, they understood it implicitly, but, and they were shocked. I mean, they thought we were crazy.
Well, are you sure we aren't?
Oh, no, I don't think we're crazy by our human nature, but we're crazy by our subjugation to institutions. Our human nature knows how to share the land through territorial claims, just like all other species claim territory. But for a territorial claim to be valid, you have to be living on it, and you have to be prepared to defend it as the land upon whose resources you depend for survival. And unfortunately, property, there's no limit to how much someone can own, and the owner doesn't have to live on it. The owner doesn't even have to be dependent on for survival. So there's a big difference between territorial claims and property rights. So I think property rights is a seed of international conflict.
Yeah, I'd like to move on from here.
Okay.
No problem. I have a question from Diane, and then Paul, you're up after that. Diane Keefe asks, what are the prospects for gaining momentum on Sanders, Warren, and Lee poison bills in 2021? And is that an effective focus in organizing?
I'm sorry, poison bills?
No, it was the bill to decrease military spending by 10% and put it into human needs in both the House and Senate.
So there was an effort last summer to move 10% of U.S. military spending, not 10% of the whole U.S. military spending, which is over $1 trillion a year, but just of the Pentagon's part of it, 700 some billion, so 70 some billion, to move that from military spending to urgent human and environmental needs, dealing with the pandemic crisis, et cetera. And there was a poll done and found that a significant majority of the US public was in favor. But of course, it was soundly defeated in the House and the Senate in a bipartisan fashion. And Congresswoman Lee and Congressman Pocan announced that they were forming a military spending reduction caucus, which they mischaracterized as a defense spending reduction caucus. And they got about 17 Congress members to join it. They never made it public. They never created a website or said what it would mean to be in it. And now they're working on that. They're asking Congress members to join it. They're figuring out what they'll be committing to, if anything, when they join it. And rootsaction.org, where I work, has a page set up where you can email your Miss Representative and your 2 senators and ask them to please join that caucus and to commit to working to move 10% of military spending or more to human and environmental needs, which would leave the United States remarkably far distant first place in the world in military spending, dramatically higher military spending than the United States some years back, about as much as the rest of the world put together, still a vast majority of your tax dollars going to military spending. So wouldn't it be exactly cutting off the beloved military, at its knees? It would be moving 10% when we're facing, a deadly disease pandemic, dramatic rising inequality, from the institutions that Chet was speaking of earlier that have been increasing inequality and the risk of fascism every year, and a growing risk of nuclear apocalypse, higher than it's ever been, according to the scientists who have the doomsday clock, and a growing risk of environmental collapse of various sorts, according to numerous experts. So I don't think there's any better initiative we can advance, but we are dealing with the US Congress, and there are things you can do locally and globally that have far better prospects of quick success if you are one of these activists who loves successes. But there's nothing more important, I think, than advancing that agenda, as well as Congresswoman Lee's bill, which would go much farther and move $350 billion out of militarism.
Excellent. Next up, we have Paul, and then after that, Howard. You're up after Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, David. I just want to join my fellow humanists in thanking you for your presentation this morning. It's really refreshing to hear a full-throated support of anti-war, full-throated denial of war, and I want to thank you for it. I do think that there's so many ideas here. There's a statement that says war is the health of the state. And one of my questions would be, how do we maintain the form of our quote unquote nation, our government, without the keystone of war being, you pretty much made the point that the whole structure is war-based. So removing war from the equation, how does that, what does that look like? And the other thing is, I just wanted to respond to what Chet was saying, is there's a difference between property, and land. Okay, I think he was talking about land ownership, and I consider property to be things that are fashioned out of land and resources. But anyway, thanks again, and just wanted to know. How would you think of a stateless society? Tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first of all, thank you. You're very welcome. I think the war as the health of the state as a criticism of World War I was a sound criticism. There was a governmental interest in the war that benefited those in government more than it benefited the rest of the world, most of which, suffered dramatically from the war and its consequences and its lost economic opportunities and the disease pandemic that it spread and so forth. But I don't think you need war to have a healthy government. There are governments on earth that spend nothing, $0 on militaries, and every single government on earth is closer to that zero military budget than it is to the US military budget. That is, nobody else spends even close to half what the US spends, and much of the rest of the world's spending is by US allies on US weapons. So it's perfectly possible to have a healthy government without, and to have an abusive and oppressive government or a democratic and rights-respecting government without war, without preparations for war, without militarism. Whether the US retains its virtually untweaked form of government that it's had for over 2 centuries is not at the top of my list of concerns. I would be happy if it could have various significant changes made. That we will get anytime soon to a stateless society, short of a nuclear apocalypse and a very bad system of stateless society. I have my doubts, but I am in favor of moving power to the global level and moving power to the state and local levels. I think there's far too much at the national level, and I'm in favor of cleaning out the money and cleaning out the communication system and cleaning out the anti-democratic problems in our system of government, including the filibuster, if not the Senate, and including cultural opposition to democracy. But World Beyond War and myself, we've drafted proposals for reforming the United Nations, reforming systems of government. But we don't need that to end war. But it would be, it would be nice and it would be helpful.
Thank you. Last question, Howard, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Mr. Swanson, thank you very much for being here today. I'm an old tax protester from many years ago. Most on this site maybe do not know that, but I did not pay taxes back in the early 80s. I quit filing for 3 years. And in reference to kind of what Chet said, what they went and did was they put a lien on my property. When I was in South Carolina, I could not buy property. I then moved to Missouri and they put a lien on me there where I could not buy property. And so if you do protest, which I did for 3 years, I did not file taxes. I put a 0 down for my W-2 because I was very upset. I'm an old anti-Vietnam War guy. And so this is what they do. And Chet's somewhat right in that. That's what they do. You can't own property. They put a lien on you. They didn't put me in jail. They just sent letters to me constantly and did that. I've lived in, 8 different states and been anti-war my whole life because of NAM. And I don't see it getting any better. I have followed you for the last 20 years. I forget when you started, but I've bought your books, read your stuff. It helped me focus more on what's going on. I didn't know the consequences of not paying taxes at the time. I did beat them. I did beat them by learning that the statute of limitations runs out after 10 years. And so I got an attorney, filed that, and that was into my being threatened by the IRS. But I will say that I don't see things getting better. I would like it to be better, but I don't see it getting better. The latest 4 years we've had with this administration seems to be getting worse. And you may know the state of Arizona. They just voted in a bunch of crazy people in the Republican Party. And I don't see this getting better in this state. There's so much against education. There's so much against everything that this country is supposed to stand for. But I read your books. I understand the history of genocide and all that Hitler, all this stuff. I'm on the same page with you. I've seen this forever. That's the only thing that happens with age, I think, is you realize a lot of these things have happened, and what you've said is true. And the younger people on this site need to really reread some of your books and understand that this is what this country has done. They had the ability to avoid war, and they didn't do it. And I live in Mesa, Arizona, which is where the Apache helicopter is made. And I taught at high school there. And my anti-war activities called me a lot of grief from people over there, because these were sons of people that worked at that helicopter factory. And this goes on and on. And I've sent you money. I bought you books. I support people like yourself because this has to end. But I'm just not hopeful. I'm old. I'm 69 now, and I just don't know, David. I hope you keep doing what you're doing, and I hope it gets out to other people that are on our website today listening as humanists, because I actually didn't know as a humanist till I ran into the group a number of years ago and realized we're all pretty much on the same page that you are. We pretty much get that. We need to treat people decently, and hopefully they'll defund the budget and use this for humanitarian help, like the pandemic we have going on. But thank you again, sir, for being on here. And Ron, thank you for getting this man to be here and speaking to us, because this is very, very important. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Howard. I have another webinar starting in 90 seconds. So let me say thank you to you and thank you for your service and what you just described and your comments. And thank you to all of you. I actually don't care whether things are getting better or worse. I think the concern with whether they are getting better or worse is a major drain on our energies as activists. We have a moral duty to make things get better, but I like to tell people the things that are getting better, that we just had the first president in our lifetimes who didn't start a major new war, though he escalated several, that we just had Congress for the first time use the War Powers Resolution from the Vietnam era and end a war, but it was vetoed, and now they've got to do it again on the war on Yemen. And of course, we should inform people that taxes are not just hated because the rich pay at a lower rate than the poor, or because you don't get anything back for them because it all goes to wars, but also because they were supposed to be temporary. They were created for the beloved World War II, and they were supposed to be temporary. And World War II ended, supposedly, but the taxes are still here. So stop loving World War II and hating taxes, or explain to me how it makes sense. I got to run. You guys are great. Keep in touch. Email me.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for coming. Again, if you enjoyed our content, then smash the subscribe button, contribute to our Patreon, become a member of HSGP, or volunteer to make the magic happen. Be well, stay safe, and take care. Thank you very much for coming.